the evening. They won't be as frequent as earlier in the day, though, and the winds will be gradually easing here too. It will be a mostly dry end to the day for northeastern England, where only a few showers are likely. Skies will be largely clear here, but with a calm and cold night ahead. The sleet and snow showers will continue for a time across Scotland this evening, with some icy patches too, though things are going to turn drier overnight with a sharp frost. Still blustery with further showers across parts of Northern Ireland through the evening, though the winds here should quickly drop out. A few further spells of rains possible here overnight. The showers and winds will ease, turning things calm but cold overnight. And that's how the weather's looking.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon, you're watching and listening to the discussion on GB News with me, Inaya Folarin Iman, where we discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. We've got a packed show for you today. Rosie Duffield MP, Mumsnet and sex denialism, free speech and the controversy over the Joe Rogan podcast, and levelling up, slogan or solution. All that and much more, but first it's the bulletins.
Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. A new photograph of the Queen working has been released to mark her Platinum Jubilee. The image, taken on Wednesday, shows the 95-year-old with her famous red box of government papers. It's 70 years today since she came to the throne. She's the first British monarch to reach the milestone. She used the occasion to give her blessing for Camilla to become Queen Consort when Prince Charles becomes king. Clarence House says the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall are touched by the gesture and congratulated Her Majesty on her inspiring service and dedication to the country. Former royal correspondent at The Sun, Charles Ray, told GB News it's a huge turnaround for the Duchess.
Remember, this is a woman who at one time was the most hated woman in Britain and was regarded as a marriage wrecker and famously the third person in a marriage which got terribly
Charles Ray. Millie Dowler's killer, Levi Belfield, has admitted to the murders of Lynn Russell and her daughter Megan, according to a lawyer. Belfield has allegedly sent a 4-page letter detailing his involvement to the solicitor of the man currently in prison for the murders. Michael Stone's lawyer says it shows his client has suffered a miscarriage of justice. Lynn and Megan Russell were found bludgeoned to death in Kent in 1996. Belfield, who murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler in 2002, is serving 2 whole life orders. The chairman of Tesco says food prices are likely to rise 5% by the spring. The supermarket chain says the impact it will have on low-income families is troubling. It follows an announcement by energy regulator Ofgem this week. The UK bills will rise by nearly £700 a year from April. Malcolm Grimston, research fellow at Imperial College, told GB News it's a difficult situation for both customers and energy companies.
I think we need to be very careful with these measures like price caps and like windfall taxes. In the very short term, they look okay, but if they end up meaning that the companies we rely on to invest so prices will come down in the future feel, why should we do that? We had years of making no money. Now we are starting to make money. It's going to be taken away from us. So why should we bother to invest? And I think at that stage, we may well find ourselves in a much worse situation.
Academic Malcolm Grimston there. Now, over in the US, podcaster Joe Rogan has apologised for saying the N-word over a number of years. The podcaster says it's regretful and shameful after a video compilation emerged of him repeatedly using the racial slur. It follows musicians, including Neil Young, accusing Rogan's podcast, which is funded by Spotify, of spreading coronavirus misinformation. A number of high-profile artists have removed their music in protest. Back here in the UK, specialist NHS teams are being brought in to get patients fit for operations in a bid to avoid last-minute cancellations. NHS England say people not being ready due to health problems account for a third of surgery appointments being delayed. Teams of nurses, doctors and care coordinators will help patients prepare for their operations from next year. The Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, says the government is looking into new legislation that would hold streaming platforms accountable for offensive content. It's after Jimmy Carr came under fire for what many are calling an abhorrent Holocaust joke on his Netflix special. The comedian, who's not responded to the criticism, joked about the deaths of thousands of Romani people at the hands of the Nazis. Lata Mangeshkar, the legendary Indian singer, has passed away at the age of 92. The iconic performer died of multiple organ failure at a hospital in Mumbai. She'd been a cultural icon in India for almost 8 decades and was the voice of many Bollywood soundtracks. The country has declared 2 days of national mourning and she'll be given a state funeral. And long-running soap opera Neighbours is being dropped by Channel 5, putting its future in doubt.
Everybody needs good neighbours.
The Australian-based show has been on screens for nearly 40 years and is more popular in the UK than it is in its homeland. A spokesperson for Channel 5 says the show, which is reliant on British funding, will run until August. The daytime drama about the residents of Ramsay Street has launched the careers of many stars, including singer Kylie Minogue and Hollywood actress Margot Robbie. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's return to the discussion.
Welcome back to the discussion. Now, this week, Labour MP for Canterbury, Rosie Duffield, stated that she is considering her future in the Labour Party after what she described as an obsessive harassment campaign from current and former party members. Several observers have speculated whether she has been targeted due to her gender-critical views. In August 2020, for example, Duffield tweeted that only women have a cervix. The news of Rosie Duffield considering leaving the Labour Party comes in the same week as online parent forum Mumsnet hosted a web chat about women in politics with Conservative MP and chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee, Caroline Noakes, and Labour MP Stella Creasy. The web chat was filled with questions that requested the MPs define the word woman, leading to a Mumsnet moderator to state that they would delete any further questions regarding the trans debate so as not to dominate the discussion in one subject. It now seems like not a week goes by without the subject of gender, sex and trans identity dominating the news. Therefore, should this issue really be taking as much time as it currently is? Or conversely, is this a difficult but necessary discussion that may even get to the very heart of some fundamental questions about what it means to be human and the nature of man and woman? Well, joining me now to discuss these issues is Stephanie Davy-Arise, Director of Transgender Trend. Thank you so much for joining me, Stephanie. Firstly, as I mentioned in the introduction, do you really think that this trans debate should really be taking as much time in the public debate as it currently is?
Well, I think, it's instructive that the Mumsnet debate focused on this issue, and mothers, women, want to know what politicians think, how politicians define the word woman. It shows, and politicians should really take note of this, that this is the biggest issue for women, because the word woman is being redefined in our language and in policy and legislation. Caroline Noakes' answer to the question of what a woman is was that basically anybody is a woman if they identify as a woman, including men. So now, for women's rights and for women's protections, it's a key issue. It impacts on every other issue that women campaign for. If we cannot define what a woman is, we cannot defend or even speak about the rights and protections of women.
I mean, you are the director of Transgender Trend. Could you tell me a little bit more about the organisation and why it was created?
Well, I set that up in 2015, really, because I was alarmed by the number of stories in the press about very young children being transitioned in the schools, and I researched the issue, and I set up the website because I realised that there wasn't a resource for parents that was fact-based and evidence-based. It was all ideology from political lobby groups. And the evidence is not there for medical transition of children in particular. And I was particularly worried about the medical transition of children and the lack of evidence base to support that treatment, along with the teaching in schools. And now, of course, we have in schools teaching that it's gender identity that makes you a boy or a girl, so your inner feelings and not your biology. So I was very concerned about those issues and wanted to set up a support organisation for parents who are also worried.
I mean, why do you think that defining the word woman is so important? I mean, this has been a development over several years now, and it seems that particularly younger generations, but other organisations and groups, and we're seeing it increasingly in law, for example, in Scotland, are embracing this new idea that actually gender is about your inner feeling, your inner psychological state, and it is separate to sex, and actually gender is more important in terms of how you see yourself and who you are. I mean, why do you think that's such a problem?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the mums on Mumsnet were called radicalised for bringing up this issue. 5 minutes ago, everybody would have agreed that a woman is woman. The definition of the word woman is adult human female, and I think most people understand the word woman to mean that, and it's meant that forever. And then suddenly, it doesn't mean that anymore. It means a person of either sex who has some sort of indefinable inner feeling of womanhood, which I don't have an inner sense. I don't identify as a woman. I am a woman. I know that because being a woman is a biological fact. By definition, it means female. So I think that the prevailing ideology and the change in language and in policy is a result of quite a few factors, but I think in particular the actions of a very powerful global lobby who've been working behind the scenes for years with policymakers and politicians to change the law, and that people have not known that this was going on and this was happening.
Yeah,
so people are more and more aware now.
Yeah, but groups like, organisations like Stonewall and the LGBT Council and so on, they would say that they're acting in what they have understood to be the best interests of transgender people, that they do not feel comfortable in the current sex binary or the gender binary that we have within a society, and actually allowing people to choose a multitude amount of genders that they feel most comfortable with, and society shifting in that direction will make it much easier for the people that have historically been excluded or felt uncomfortable with how we conceive of gender right now?
You know, it's fine for anybody to identify in any way they want. And I think you'll find that most feminists, most women support men being allowed to wear dresses and makeup. And certainly happened in the 80s, where there were a lot of men, there was a culture of men wearing makeup, and that seems to have disappeared. So, yeah, freedom in expression, in identity, absolutely fine. But you have to base policy and law on facts and not on people's subjective feelings. And if you're defining woman as a subjective inner feeling, then you're not going to be able to implement laws that protect biological females, which is the definition of woman. So, for example, we have rapists called women, and we're told we have to call them women, or otherwise we're transphobic. Whereas anything to do with being female, such as pregnancy or menstruation, we cannot use the word woman because that is also transphobic. So we're uterus havers or we're pregnant people. So the word woman is being erased in language unless it applies to trans people.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie Davies-Aria, Director of Transgender Trend, for discussing her thoughts on this issue. Now, to take a broader look at this debate and how it's playing out in other Western countries, I'm very delighted to be joined by evolutionary biologist and managing editor of Quillette magazine, Colin Wright. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon in the UK, Colin. In the UK, the controversy over gender and sex is pretty far gone. It's in the news every single day. There's lots of groups and organisations that have popped up on both sides to campaign on either side of the issue. Where would you say this debate is at right now in America?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'd say America is doing far worse than the UK, but somehow considerably better than Canada. In the UK, there appears to be a much more cohesive and organized movement that's making really great strides in pushing back against a lot of the pseudoscientific nonsense being used to infringe upon women's sex-based rights and their protective spaces. The UK is also doing a much better in fighting gender ideology in medicine, especially as it relates to affirming children suddenly who purport to be trans and receiving puberty blockers. In the US, I think we're just much more disorganized. Many people are simply just not as awake to the insanity as a lot of the Brits are. I'm not sure exactly why that is. Some of it probably has to do with how toxically polarized American politics are, where one side is literally willing to deny the existence of males and females entirely in order to portray themselves as crusaders for love and justice, while demonizing anyone who opposes them as fascists and transphobes. The degree of polarization has really cemented a lot of people into these reality-denying beliefs. But Canada is the absolute worst of all this. It's just they've just let gender ideology sweep through the country. There's probably a lot of just small cultural differences that are explaining a lot of these different outcomes we see in different countries.
And one of the things that's quite striking in the UK debate is that many of the campaigners against gender ideology actually come from the left. Many of them are feminists and people that have been involved in various different feminist organising and also LGBT organising for a very long time. I mean, would you say that the majority of campaigning comes from the left in America as well, or is it actually something that is primarily advocated by conservatives?
It's, I'd say, primarily advocated by conservatives, but anywhere that is right of completely woke is basically the people who are speaking out mostly. Perhaps people who are just slightly right of center are the most vocal about this whole thing, because they're kind of closer to the people who are peddling this craziness. Whereas people who are, on the further right, the evangelicals, they probably don't know anyone around them in their daily lives that are using things like gendered pronouns and who are denying sex, and they probably have just the culture in the areas that they live. They probably just don't see a lot of this stuff more, so they tend not to be as involved. But centrists, I think, is where it's at in terms of where the pushback is coming from.
One of the things that I think has been really remarkable over the last few years is the speed to which many medical and scientific journals have been using some of the gender ideology language, like sex assigned at birth and so on. I mean, how do you think this has been able to happen, and what do you make of this?
It's been really shocking. I mean, I used to be in academia, and I had this experience whenever I just touched a little bit of this whole cultural debate about sex and gender, it would just blow up in my face completely. They put these ideas out there, and anyone who raises a single eyebrow gets called a bigot, a transphobe, a Nazi, a fascist. I've been called all these things for telling friends that there were two sexes when they shared some article that bizarrely claimed that there were 5. The first response is to just disproportionately this disproportionate response to your claims, whatever they might be, that makes you sort of shut up real fast and learn that unless you want to be humiliated, that you better stop talking about these things. There's a lot of medical professionals and people in the sciences who are just really too afraid to speak up, given how much time investment it takes to get to their point in their careers. And if they were to be the only one to stand up against this stuff, well, all the arrows are going to be hurled at them immediately. And, it might be difficult for them to get a job if their hiring committees are composed of people who are, of this ideology. So it's just sort of a chilling effect that is causing a lot of this portrayal of this false consensus of issues like sex, where I hear people say that sex is a spectrum and that's just the way it is. But that wasn't the way it is, just 3 years ago when nobody was saying that. It all of a sudden has just sort of swept through.
And you wrote in the Wall Street Journal an article about pronouns. I mean, do you think that there are ways in which we are increasingly conceding in everyday life to many of this kind of gender ideology thinking?
Yeah. So I wrote an article about how, this prevalent or increasingly prevalent practice of having people state their pronouns whenever they meet somebody. We had the Human Rights Campaign in the US, which is one of the biggest organizations. They made a tweet saying that every time you have a conversation, you need to begin with, "Hi, my pronouns are he, him. What are yours?" And I wrote this article that's saying that because of the ideology that's underpinning these pronoun rituals, which is the idea that the terms man, woman, boy, and girl are completely disconnected from your biological sex, and it reflects like this inner sense of who you are, that basically relates to social stereotypes and roles associated with sex, that if you're participating in these pronoun rituals, then you're actually operating within this whole gender ideology that is very much abolishing the notion of sex and trying to replace it with gender. So if you were to just go along with it and give your pronouns, you're basically tacitly agreeing to these types of things. I think people should resist participating in these pronoun rituals because you are becoming a mouthpiece for nonsense for these ideologues. And I think we need to push back on that. Same with using the word cis to describe anyone who's who is not trans. These are loaded terms that have a huge ideological underpinning to them. And so if you're just using their language, you're actually just being sort of a puppet for their ideology. And I think we need to be aware of where in our language we are actually perhaps unknowingly using their ideology and participating in it.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Colin Wright, Managing Editor of Quillette magazine. After the break, this week's review is all about the truth of masculinity. We'll be joined by philosopher and Male Plus columnist Charlie Peters and philosopher Nina Power. But first, it's the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking windy for many with plenty of showers. These wintry in the north. Let's take a look at the details. The afternoon's cloud and damp weather in the southwest should be clear by this evening. It will still be blustery with some sharp showers around, but also breaks in the cloud. In the southeast, there should be a good deal of dry weather to end the day, with largely clear skies too. 1 or 2 showers perhaps. There will still be plenty of showers across Wales this evening, but these will be starting to ease. The strong winds will be easing too. Showers will still be lingering around the Midlands as we head into the evening. They won't be as frequent as earlier in the day though, and the winds will be gradually easing here too. It will be a mostly dry end to the day for northeastern England, where only a few showers are likely. Skies will be largely clear here, but with a calm and cold night ahead. The sleet and snow showers will continue for a time across Scotland this evening, with some icy patches too, though things are going to turn drier overnight with a sharp frost. Still blustery with further showers across parts of Northern Ireland through the evening, though the winds here should quickly drop out. A few further spells of rain possible here overnight. The showers and winds will ease, turning things calm but cold overnight. And that's how the weather's looking.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis, and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here.
Joe Biden walking out.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Welcome back to the discussion. Well, masculinity is a term that nowadays we rarely hear without the word toxic in front of it. From questions about male violence, so-called incels, the manosphere, fatherhood and role models, to discussions about the need for men to express their emotions more. Masculinity, its meaning, its impact and its relevance is high on the political agenda. Well, philosopher Nina Power has this week published a book titled What Do Men Want?, which explores how in the era of feminism, capitalism and consumerism, how do men and women relate to one another? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Nina Power in the studio today, and also alongside her, Male Plus columnist Charlie Peters, to unpick some of these issues. I wanted to start with you, of course, Nina. In the first page of your book, you say, men and women exist. Occasionally, we even like each other. We exist because of these two simple truths. In our previous segment, we talked about kind of the trans debate. So even though perhaps it shouldn't, this statement feels slightly subversive. I mean, why did you choose to start the book with that phrase?
I suppose because I wanted to be realistic and truthful to the experience of the vast majority of people, and also to, in a way, acknowledge the reality of our interactions in their complexity, most of which are positive, right? So the fact that we have fathers and brothers and male friends and partners, and, you know, a lot of women are married and have sons. And so I suppose it was, in a way, to acknowledge this kind of basic reality and not be kind of, I don't know, afraid of it, actually. And to try and write a kind of reasonable book about all of those kind of often very beautiful relationships that we have.
And I mean, as I mentioned in the introduction, I mean, oftentimes when we hear the word masculinity nowadays, it starts with the word toxic. I mean, what do you think about how we talk about and how we understand masculinity today?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the main arguments in the book is to try and talk about the way in which masculinity also refers to the possibility of being a good man, which I think is often kind of obscured or occluded by this idea that all masculinity is negative, that men need to kind of constantly feel guilty. I think if we want to encourage men to be better, and indeed we can all be better, we're all a combination of good and bad, we can all try better to be sort of, good people. And I suppose it's like saying, if we want that to be possible, then we can't condemn men in this kind of blanket way. It makes absolutely no sense to say that all masculinity is toxic, right? So I wanted to resurrect some kind of older ideas of male virtue, of virility, things that are often associated with like kind of a conservative approach. But I don't think what I'm saying is conservative. I think actually in the current context, it's really optimistic.
And Charlie, what do you think about that? Do you think that we need to revive the idea of a kind of male virtue, and actually how we talk about men and think about men today isn't very good?
Oh, I absolutely agree. It's not very good. I mean, there's very little space, it feels, in modern commentary on positive masculinity or masculine virtues at all. It's very tough to decide upon what they actually are in the first place because there is so little conversation about it. When you ask someone about feminine virtues, they jump straight away to, about care, concern, empathy, love. But ask about masculinity, and I think often there's a rush to violence and coldness, and there's little time dedicated to exploring how masculinity can be a good force for society, especially in kind of protection, and actually a different form of love and care, which is incredibly valuable and certainly missed.
And some people would push back and say, well, what about the incel phenomenon? Or what about, for example, in the era of Me Too, we've had a lot of conversations as a society about male sexual harassment of women and just male violence in general. And actually, men have had it so good for so long, they can have a couple decades of maybe not necessarily being seen as the positive, ideal role model within society.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of finished the book by talking about reconciliation and forgiveness, and I talk about the Me Too movement, and, there were excesses there, right? I think we're talking about pendulum swinging, whether we're talking about the sexual revolution, whether we're talking about whether men or women are dominant in certain ways. So I try to kind of present a sort of reasonable balance. And again, I think the only way to get out of these kind of situations of misunderstanding, of miscommunication, of violence and so on is not to condemn all men. I think that actually makes it worse. I think the so-called incel phenomenon, a lot of the time we're talking about young, economically dispossessed men who want a girlfriend. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think a lot of the time there's sort of misattribution, and it's almost like certain groups are allowed to be demonized. You're allowed to hate these people. This isn't a good way to progress. This is not how we get along. And in fact, most of the time we do get along. And I wanted to kind of acknowledge that.
Another thing that I thought was quite striking when reading your book, you said, if masculinity is in trouble today, it is because our understanding of humanity as a whole is in trouble. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I suppose, it goes back to the opening line about men and women existing. I think we are kind of compatible and cooperative and different at the same time. And I think it's in that kind of frisson of difference that, like, everything interesting happens between us. And so I suppose it's like, again, starting from that recognition of the two sexes and our interaction and all of the things that follow from that. And
Charlie, do you think that we have difficulty as a society talking about males and females as different, or men and women as different? Do you think it makes us uncomfortable talking about that?
Yes, I think that is true as an understatement. There is an enormous amount of difficulty there. You've covered some of it on your show already today. We often hear this term erasure used by feminist activists, gender-critical activists, but we don't hear it often with regards to men as well, because clearly there is an issue where positive depictions of masculinity or conversations about being a man in general are erased from modern commentary. And often we also find that any conversation about men, which is about their concern, about their life, about their health, that's also run in a sort of patronising and concerning tone, not in actually an understanding man's nature and how we are in our flesh and blood and how we are in our minds. And I think, especially in the case of male suicide, an area of huge concern. The area of concern actually is most commonly raised when we talk about men and their well-being there is this concern that men should be more like women in order to stop killing themselves or stop being mentally ill. That the reason why men are so sad is because they are too manly and they need to speak up, talk more, engage with their friends. I think this is wrong. I think often men are upset to a level of suicide and depression because they don't feel useful. And there has been a misunderstanding of the virtues that make them feel happy and loved and needed. And so instead of engaging with that frontage, which requires an appreciation and acknowledgement of masculinity, we instead talk about you should be more feminine.
And finally, Nina, on Charlie's point about men don't really feel useful, you talk about that we kind of live in a cruel culture when it comes to some of the backlash and reaction when people do the wrong thing. I mean, how do we cultivate that more playful culture that you talk about? How do we go beyond the now?
Well, I think if you think about Christian virtues and Christian values, for example, that built into that is an idea of forgiveness, the fact that we're all kind of flawed, we all make mistakes. You know, we kind of have a very puritanical culture in some ways, which sort of encourages hedonism, but then sort of punishes people very brutally if they make a mistake and get it wrong. And so I think, you know, we need to move back to a more complex understanding of our nature, you know, male nature, female nature, and in a way take things in a more light-hearted direction that involve humour, you know, not being kind of always offended or too quick to be the victim. You know, as well for women as well, you know, women are not victims, they're not children. You know, I hate this idea that women are somehow always vulnerable and should always be fearful. You know, we're adults, you know, we take risks with our lives and that's what makes it meaningful.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Charlie Peters, columnist at Mel Plus, and Nina Power, philosopher and author of What Do Men Want? Well, coming up in this week's Moral Dilemmas, the controversy surrounding Spotify and the podcaster Joe Rogan continues to mount. We'll be discussing this right after the news.
It's 3:33. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. The Queen says it's her sincere wish that Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, becomes Queen Consort when Prince Charles becomes King. She made the announcement in her Platinum Jubilee message as she became the first monarch in British history to reach the milestone. Clarence House says Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall are touched and honoured by the gesture. Millie Dowler's killer, Levi Belfield, has admitted to the murders of Lynn Russell and her daughter Meghan, according to a lawyer. Belfield has allegedly sent a 4-page letter detailing his involvement in the killings to the solicitor of the man currently in prison for the murders. Michael Stone's lawyer says the admission shows his client has suffered a miscarriage of justice. Lynn and Meghan Russell were found bludgeoned to death in Kent in 1996. The chairman of Tesco says food prices are likely to rise 5% by the spring. The supermarket chain says the impact it will have on low-income families is troubling. It follows an announcement by energy regulator Ofgem that UK bills will rise by nearly £700 a year from April. Long-running soap opera Neighbours is being dropped by Channel 5, putting its future in doubt. The Australian-based show has been on screens for nearly 40 years and is more popular in the UK than it is in its homeland. A spokesperson for Channel 5 says the show, which is reliant on British funding, will run on the channel until August. You're up to date. There's plenty more on the main news story at the top of the next hour.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the discussion. The controversy surrounding Spotify and the podcast of Joe Rogan continues to mount. On Saturday night, Spotify took down 113 episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast from its platform after Rogan issued an apology for having used racial slurs on his platform in the past. Rogan stated that many of the clips had been taken out of context of 12 years of conversations on my podcast, his words, and that he had often used a slur while quoting comedians such as Paul Mooney and Lenny Bruce, or while discussing the use of the word in movies directed by the filmmaker Quentin Tarantino. The controversy around his podcast accelerated when singer-songwriter Neil Young announced his exit from the service, citing misinformation which he claimed Joe Rogan had spread about COVID-19. The controversy has raised big questions about free speech, skepticism, so-called misinformation, the new media versus the legacy media, and the role of big tech companies in shaping the public space. Well, joining me now is Rav Aurora, a culture and politics writer on Substack and contributor to the New York Post, as well as Charlie Peters, Mail Plus columnist, still with me this afternoon. So first I'll go to you, Rav. What do you make of what's going on with Joe Rogan and his podcast right now?
Yeah. I think there's this big contradiction here right now where I feel like Joe Rogan and his podcast have done more to expose misinformation than they have to propagate it. Early on the Joe Rogan Experience, well before these things were found out to be true or...
Oh, Rav seems to be breaking up. We'll go to Charlie for now. What do you make of what's going on, Charlie?
Well, I think the whole conversation around misinformation, disinformation is totally false. And what we really have here is an attempt by ideological opponents of Joe Rogan and the kind of people he'd have on his podcast to frame the conversation around their discussion, their conversation, their rules. Nobody else gets a chance. So any suggestion that the reason why they're clamping down on Joe Rogan is because he is causing people's minds to be warped with fake news, completely false.
But isn't that very much part of the mindset that it's either, someone is doing it completely disingenuously? Can you not see how some people might genuinely be worried about some of the people that he's had on his platform? He's had people like Dr. Robert Malone who have voiced very strong doubts about the vaccine rollout in the height of a pandemic, and in some senses weaponized his credentials in order to shield himself from criticism. I think some people might just feel that this is a step too far at such a life or death moment within the society.
Well, I mean, I've had 3 vaccines now, and I think the most important thing to have at the height of a pandemic is free and open speech about what is happening. You will not secure confidence in your vaccine rollout or in the scheme in general if you censor voices who are opposed to it. I think this is true of vaccines and it's true of wider political debates as well. Any system that has to silence and censor its opponents to justify its existence is fraudulent and will struggle under its own knees.
And we were just talking in the break that maybe Joe Rogan potentially left himself vulnerable for signing a contract with a corporation. I mean, if he was independent, there's many podcasters that just have an independent platform and people listen to them. But when you sign a contract potentially, are you then opening yourself up to the kinds of corporate pressure that he's effectively signed up to?
He has signed up to corporate pressure, there's no doubt about that, but that doesn't mean you should sign up to caving in. You should resist these forces as much as you can. He's clearly been lent on very strongly by Spotify to adjust his tag and apologise. But as we all know, and we've learned over decades, the worst way to deal with a censorious mob coming after your work is to apologise, because you pay that little bit of Danegeld and you think they'll go away and they'll never come back, and then they get a little bit of blood and they come back for the full body 5 minutes later. It won't work. But also more broadly, corporate culture clearly needs a jolt. It needs someone to resist this censorious and very punitive culture. Complete lack of forgiveness, complete lack of context in these conversations. Joe Rogan is an incredibly powerful voice, hundreds of millions of listeners. If anyone was able to resist this kind of pressure, it could have been him. And so while it's disappointing for him that he's, caved this way, it's also disappointing for people like me who are interested in conversation and want, resistance to this culture.
I think we've got Rav back now. I guess a question that I'll ask you, Rav, is, Joe Rogan is one of the biggest podcasters in the world. He has an average of 11 million listeners. Isn't that something that will cause him to have some kind of responsibility for the people that he has on his platform and the impact that that is having? At some point, is it not fair to ask big questions about people that have such a huge sway over the public debate? Why they're doing that, why they have that those kinds of guests, and what impact that might be having?
Yeah. Can you hear me now, by the way? Am I good?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Listen, I feel like right now where we're headed in our public policy direction, the things that are being implemented by our governments around the world, we're still mandating vaccines here in Canada and in the US, even though the vaccines right now are 10% effective in combating transmission, according to Pfizer. That's the 2 doses of the vaccine. Now we're pushing boosters now on college students, for example, despite zero efficacy or safety data. It's a low risk population.
But on that point, Rav, on that point about Joe Rogan, does he have responsibility? That's the thing. When you have a platform of 11 million listeners on average, do they not have a responsibility to have some kind of accountability for who's on their platform and why they're platforming certain people?
Absolutely. I think that he should be responsible for the guests he's having on his show. But I think he's been asking seriously critical questions that are important to ask, given the fact that the government is pushing these draconian policies. And I think guests he's had on his show have been right about a number of things early on, including masking. Alex Berenson was on his show, who I don't always agree with, about a year ago, talking about how masks are basically highly ineffective or next to useless. And everybody called him a conspiracy theorist. And now that's on CNN. Early on, he had libertarian activist, commentator Dave Smith on to talk about how we might be mandating vaccines, and everybody considered that to be a conspiracy view. And it turns out that that's eventually what happened. And the whole myocarditis issue, I've written about this on my Substack. Several medical experts have looked at this and have found that Rogan's view is more in line with the data opposed to the media attacking him.
Rav, overwhelmingly, medical professionals, people that have been working in this industry, epidemiologists, virologists, and so on, undoubtedly, overwhelmingly back the vaccine. Over hundreds of millions of people have taken it globally. Do you really think that Joe Rogan's more skeptical perspective of some of the COVID-19 mitigation advice is really where the evidence is at?
Listen, I am for the vaccine generally, and I think people over, let's say, 40 or 30 should get vaccinated. In terms of Rogan's skepticism, I think he is fully right when it comes to natural immunity, for example, which isn't being recognized. I think when it comes to side effects, there were certain points made that were considered conspiracy, such as heart inflammation in young men and menstrual bleeding in young women. There's a new UK study that came out showing that a significant portion of young women are experiencing these irregularities in their menstrual cycles, which seem to be transient and innocuous. But these kind of things that Rogan has been talking about, he's been correct about that. And I don't think he's anti-vax. And I think certain individuals he's had on, like Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Peter McCullough, may have certain questionable views about vaccination broadly. But I think certain questions he's been asking, especially among young people, the generation that I care about, and I'm 20 and I read a lot about these issues, I think he's been spot on in pointing out that there are certain downsides to vaccination among young people, particularly the heart inflammation issue, the myocarditis. And he's been asking those questions when the government is on the other side mandating these things, which are incredibly dangerous. And I've interviewed several young individuals, young men who have had myocarditis from the vaccine because they've taken it, and they haven't had the information that's being provided on the Joe Rogan Experience that should be provided by the government and by our public health authorities.
Yeah. Charlie, what do you make of some of the things that Rav is saying? One of the arguments is that actually, in some senses, it's the mainstream media and the establishment that have created figures like Joe Rogan because they haven't been able to have an open, honest conversation about COVID-19 mitigation, health measures and so on, that they've effectively left a vacuum in place for other people to ask the kinds of questions that are not being asked in the mainstream sphere.
Well, that's absolutely true. There is no doubt that alternative media figures like Joe Rogan and others spout up because mainstream media opposition and commentators miss out important things, entirely sideline them, no matter how crucial they are. This is undoubtedly something that happens. And we also know very well that mainstream media figures and, of course, government guidelines often get these things wrong. You think back to the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, some of the advice on masks was completely overturned, large gatherings, and all sorts of ideas about the messaging on how the virus spreads, this obsession with hand washing. It's clear that there are very many areas where the government guidelines and the media advice, they get it wrong. And so it's absolutely vital that alternative media sources are able to, where possible, correct the record and provide an alternative source of information.
And also, Charlie, I mean, it seems, though, however, even with all of these arguments about free speech and scepticism and open public debate, the reality is that there's one way that governments are going, and that is towards internet regulation and internet censorship. In the UK specifically, we've got the online harms paper that is being debated and going through the House. I mean, it seems that this era is over, and maybe people that support free speech need to think of a new strategy, because it doesn't seem like this argument is really gaining as much sympathy as perhaps it should be.
Yes, well, I predict a very miserable future for freedom of speech, where we have on one hand, we have incredibly censorious and punitive government forces, and on the other, the only people who are breaking through the alternative media conversation are people who are advocating horse medicine or whatever. I think we definitely need a more balanced and objective media discussion, and some resistance from the government in terms of censorship would be absolutely crucial to that. We've heard over the last few days, for example, in this Jimmy Carr Netflix controversy, that the media minister here in the UK is thinking about punishing companies that host this kind of content, jokes. And if you're going to ban jokes, you can certainly expect them to ban alternative concepts when it comes to medicine and pandemics.
And my final word to you, I mean, what do you think attracts many young people, particularly young men on this show today? We've been talking about gender and masculinity and so on. What do you think really is the attraction of Joe Rogan to millions of young men in particular around the world?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think his appeal is that he has a completely kind of unfiltered perception and discussion of a variety of topics. And there's a number of things here. There's just the sheer variety of guests he has on. In one conversation, they can be talking about COVID misinformation, vaccines, and then jump to psychedelics and UFOs and global, international, political issues, et cetera, et cetera. I think he's just an honest person. He seems like a very regular guy. What you see seems to be very much in line with probably who he is in real life, whereas with a lot of other shows, that's just not the case.
Well, thank you so much, Rav Aurora, culture and politics writer at ravaurora.substack and contributor to the New York Post. And Charlie, stay with us for the next segment. And in the next segment, we're talking about the question of levelling up. Long-promised plans to close the gap between rich and poor parts of the country have been announced by the government. The strategy, unveiled by Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove, will take until 2030 and aims to improve services such as education, broadband and transport. Mr Gove said it would shift both money and power into the hands of working people. The Labour said the plans contained no new money and very little fresh thinking. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Luke Rakes, Research Director at the Fabian Society. Thank you so much for joining me. What do you make of, firstly, this whole notion of levelling up? It does seem quite a new idea following the Brexit referendum to give power in the hands of the people and give inequality a more centre focus when it comes to policy.
Well, it's a new brand, but for a very old idea. And we've had a north-south divide, so to speak, since the middle of the 19th century. So, more than 150 years of this kind of divide. It also, of course, affects the southwest. It affects people in London as well because of the overheating capital that makes house prices so high. So it affects all people in all parts of the country. I think it's very familiar to people. But levelling up is, of course, the brand that Boris Johnson has used since 2019 to talk about it. Before that, we did, of course, have the Northern Powerhouse. And since 2010, unfortunately, however, for the last 12 years, we've had a government that's kind of levelled down, if you will. They've cut a lot of council budgets. They've cut the funding that was exactly supposed to level up all of this time. So it's welcome that they're now looking at it, but it feels like after 12 years, it's a little bit late, to be honest. But it's good that they're starting, shall we say.
But some people are saying that the Conservatives are moving left economically and rightwards culturally, and to some sense, this vacuum has been left by the Labour Party that some people would argue have been focusing more on cultural questions of identity rather than material questions of inequality. What do you think of that analysis?
Well, I think Labour, when in government, did actually do a lot of the policies that this exact white paper starts to talk about. So it is actually quite familiar to a lot of people who used to work for the new Labour government in the early 2000s. The idea of targets, the idea of services working to a regional footprint was something that the Conservatives wiped out from 2010 onwards. Let's not forget, of course, Labour is in power at the moment in councils, in mayoralties and in Wales, and they do deliver a lot of regional policy, but they do so often against the headwind of a Conservative government that cuts their budgets away. So it's nice to see some of this starting to be reversed, but we can't get away from the fact that we've had 12 years of Conservative-led governments taking the very money away that they're now proposing to start doing a little bit about. But as you say, they're not really going to put more money into it. They're just going to start to direct the money they currently spend in a more regional way.
Levelling up what was part of the cause for greater democracy and dealing with inequality following Brexit, and what was obviously striking with the Labour Party is that they advocated a second referendum policy and didn't embrace Brexit. I mean, do you think that was a missed opportunity, not developing effectively a Lexit strategy?
Well, I think when we look at the way that the country's developed for many decades, in fact, since the 1980s, since deindustrialisation, quite an antagonistic approach to the way that we've developed our regional economies, that set a lot of balls rolling in terms of Brexit. It made people got very disaffected with the EU, with the national government in the UK as well. And that did sort of plant a lot of seeds that led to that referendum result. And could Labour in government have done more about that? They did do something. As I've said, they did certainly more the Conservatives have done since 2010, but perhaps they could have done more a long time ago to stop people feeling so disaffected with the way that they were governed, both in the UK and across the EU. And disaffection is common across not just the EU, but across the high-income world, across developed countries, on the continent of Europe and in the United States. We do see people reacting to deindustrialisation in this way, but in the UK, the response has largely been to leave the EU.
And finally, I mean, what do you make of net zero? Some people have pointed to that as some of the fault of effectively the cost of living crisis and the energy problems that we're seeing right now. I mean, how do you square the goal to reach net zero and demands that we consume less and use less with the need for industry and productivity and transport infrastructure and house building?
Well, actually, the solutions are common. In fact, they dovetail quite nicely, and particularly for post-industrial communities across the country. There's actually the opportunity to create jobs just, fitting insulation and replacing people's boilers and so on. So there's actually quite a lot of work in that for young people in the towns that levelling up is supposed to be dealing with. So actually, they're not pulling against one another. In fact, they could be working together. Now, both the Conservatives and Labour have talked about this agenda, talked about the opportunities of actually transitioning to an economy which is less carbon intensive. It needs to be done properly. It isn't being done properly right now by this government, but both parties need to bring forward some plans to create jobs while also decarbonising.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. That was the Research Director for the Fabian Society. Just final word to you, Charlie. I mean, what do you think of levelling up? Is it just a slogan, or do you think it is a game-changing solution?
Well, I hope it is a game-changing solution to the vast amounts of regional inequality that we have, because clearly this costs us on our overall domestic wealth levels. We clearly have a huge issue where the UK economy is wildly imbalanced towards London and the southeast, which creates an enormous brain drain from the rest of the regions of the country and pits us negatively against our compatriots and our colleagues in Europe. They have much more regionally balanced economies, and that creates a huge benefit to them.
Well, thank you so much, Charlie Peters, Mail Plus columnist, for joining us for the whole show. That's all from us on The Discussion. See you at the same time next week. Up next is Nana Queer. Thank you.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking windy for many, with plenty of showers. These wintry in the north. Let's take a look at the details. The afternoon's cloud and damp weather in the southwest should be clear by this evening. It will still be blustery with some sharp showers around, but also breaks in the cloud. In the southeast, there should be a good deal of dry weather to end the day, with largely clear skies too. 1 or 2 showers.